Knowing Jesus. My guest today had everything available to him. Born to wealthy parents, a mother in show business. Everything could be his. But he wasn't really living, not until he met Jesus himself. Stay with me. I'll be talking with Doug Batchelor, the richest caveman.
When you embrace life's journey with a purposeful outlook and a focused perspective, when you have a passion for mission, extreme service, and abundant giving, a dedicated character with relentless strength and courage, when your spirit is at peace, that's really living.
As the son of a multi-millionaire father and a show business mother, Doug had everything available to him that money could buy. But he didn't have happiness. He eventually found Jesus and then began really living. In this book, Doug says that he was the richest caveman. Did you really live in a cave?
I did for about 1.5 years up in the mountains.
Why were you living in a cave?
Well, I probably need to back up and start at the beginning, as they say.
All right.
Had very interesting parents that were total opposites.
Tell me about them.
They say opposites attract.
All right.
My mother was a very liberal, creative person, Jewish background, born in New York City. And my father was a poor Okie from Oklahoma, born there before the Depression, and grew up very poor. They met in California. Dad came out during the Dust Bowl experience and learned aviation before World War I. And Mom began writing and singing. She also came to Southern California. She was an actress in a number of movies, but usually small parts. But she wrote for Elvis Presley. She was more famous as a songwriter. And then,
she wrote some of his music?
Yeah, wrote some songs. And wrote for Frank Sinatra, Andrew Williams, some of these names none of the young people remember. And was successful in that capacity. Probably most of what she did was she was a film critic on ABC for Good Morning America. And she was the president of the Los Angeles Film Critics Association and lived in Beverly Hills. So had a lot of friends in Hollywood.
How did your father make these millions?
Well, Dad began buying and selling planes after World War II. He was a captain in the Air Force and a flight instructor, very good pilot and a shrewd businessman. And there were aircraft scattered all over the world. Like, he'd go to Hawaii and he would buy a plane and fly it single-handedly, a DC-3 or something, back to the States, and you could buy them for nothing there because there were great stockpiles. And he began an air cargo leasing business called Aero Air, and then International Air Leases, and then he began buying jets and was friends with Howard Hughes and Kurt Kerkorian, and started not far from here in Burbank, California.
This is a pretty famous family, a big-time duo.
Yeah, well, they didn't stay a family long. Mom and Dad divorced when my brother and I were 3. Dad named Falcon and I after airplanes. He was named Falcon after some aircraft. I was named Douglas after the McDonnell Douglas aircraft.
I see.
And it's tough growing up with the name Falcon Batchelor. And my brother also struggled because he was born with cystic fibrosis. So, but Mom and Dad divorced about 6 years into their marriage. Mom moved back to New York City to continue her career in show business and was writing.
You went with her?
Well, my brother and I got bounced around a lot. Both our parents were very driven. My dad was very driven to be successful in business. He moved to Miami. He could see that the international and South American air routes were really exploding. And so he moved his business of Air Lease to Miami, where it still exists today. And Mom moved to New York City and to London to continue writing for Broadway and doing film critic work.
So you lived back and forth?
We lived between Grandma in California and Mom, mostly in New York City, and then summers with Dad in Florida. Once or twice we went to school in Florida. Went to 14 different schools, but only finished 9th grade. Because as we bounced around, I went to military school when I was 5 years old, Don, the first military school.
Black Five. I didn't know you
military.
could go to a military school at age
I know.
5.
I don't know how they did it, but they did it. And I started there when I was 5 years old. And that's Black Fox Military Academy. I think it just closed a couple of years ago. I went to Catholic schools and Jewish schools and private schools, public schools.
Why so many schools?
Part of it because of the moving around between parents and grandparents. Some of the schools were boarding schools, so they'd send us off. And they were in different states. Summer, they'd send it to a summer camp up in Maine, or went to a summer camp in the Florida Keys on a boat. And so we had some great experiences as far as, some privileges of seeing things. But there was very little happiness in the home. Dad struggled with alcohol all of his life. And he was, I forget the term for it, but he was a successful alcoholic in that he was able to resist the urge to drink until noon. So he'd work all morning, his head was clear, but from lunch it started going downhill. And drank himself to sleep just about every night of his adult life. Mom, in the show business, there's a lot of drugs. And it was a common thing to have parties at the house where people were taking pills, smoking pot or hashish or LSD. And
but you were sent off during that time.
No, not always. We saw it happening. When we were real young, we wondered about what was going on. We knew that it was not just cigarettes. And of course there was alcohol too that was available to my brother and I. But finally, Mom at one point said, "Look, Doug, I know that you're going to be exposed to this eventually. I just assume you do it at home." And so Mom began smoking pot with me. And
you and your mother together?
Yeah, and hashish. And she just said, "Look, I want you to do it where you feel safe. If you're out on the streets with your friends, you're going to get in trouble in New York City," which is true, but I wouldn't endorse doing that with your kids. My brother, because of his lung disease, he couldn't smoke, so my mother would make him marijuana cookies so he wouldn't feel left out.
Now, this is a different kind of upbringing than most of us have had.
Yeah, they were doing the best they knew how, but they did not have God in their lives, and their theories about what the purpose of life was, this is it. You make your heaven and hell here on earth, and so there's different rules that they live by.
How'd you do in school?
Well, in military school I did okay, but most of the time I did very poorly. I was dyslexic. I still struggle with that today. I didn't know what it was back then. I'm sure that if we could go back in time and they had the medications they have today, I probably would have been heavily medicated for having attention deficit disorder and been in special schools, but they didn't know all that back then. And I was hyperactive. I couldn't focus very well with studies, and so I was in and out of school a lot. Got into trouble and fights. And
were these private schools?
Some were. When I was living with Dad, he was more affluent, and he lived on a mansion, lived on an island in a mansion, and had butler and maid, and so they'd send us to some private schools, mostly Catholic school, when I was living with Dad, which was peculiar because his upbringing was Southern Baptist.
I see.
But so I was religiously, I was a little confused. In military school, they used to require you to go to some religious services every Sunday. And I wasn't sure what to do, because when I lived with Mom, she would send me to synagogue and to rabbi training. And so, but they were atheists. They just thought it was good training, good for discipline. And so in military school, some Sundays I'd go to the Protestant services, some Sundays I'd go to the Catholic services, some Sundays I'd go to the Jewish services. They even had the Jewish services on Sunday. And so I was all mixed up and very, very cynical about any Judeo-Christian religion. I felt they were all hypocrites.
In the book, right in the front, you talk about being with your mother. And you talk about your temper. I'll never amount to anything. I can't control my temper.